Hi everyone, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I'm Michael Schraffler, Associate Dean for the Arts in the College of Arts and Letters. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this week's presentation in our Ahead of the Game lecture series. This is a football season lecture series sponsored by the college. I'd like to extend a special welcome to Luis Fraga, Director of the Center for Latino Studies, and members of the Center's Advisory Council who are here in the audience. We're delighted to have all of you here today. I will hope to see you again on November 4th when Javier Navarro, a member of the Faculty in Creative Writing, will be speaking about his debut novel, Melorio, set in Puerto Rico in the wake of Hurricane Maria. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to thank our friends in the Department of Music and the Program in Sacred Music for allowing us to use this beautiful space today. I'd also like to give special thanks to Becky Badger, Senior Administrative Coordinator in the Office of the Dean of the College of Arts and Letters. Becky is here, and she worked with our speaker, with the Arts and Letters Communications Office, and with many others to make this event happen. So thanks, Becky. Now to introduce our speaker. Marisol Moreno is the Reverend John A. O'Brien Associate Professor in the Department of Romance, Languages, and Literatures. Her research and teaching focus on Afro-Latinx and Latinx Caribbean literature and other forms of artistic expression. Professor Moreno is the recipient of many awards. Among them is the Sheedy Prize for Excellence in Teaching. Her research has been published in the leading academic journals in her field, and she's the author of 2 books, Family Matters, Puerto Rican Women, Authors on the Island and the Mainland, published by University of Virginia Press in 2012, and Crossing Waters, Undocumented Migration in the Hispanophone Caribbean and Latinx Literature and Art, University of Texas Press, July 2022. Her talk today draws from her work on that book, and I'd like to note that we will have copies of Marisol's book available here today for sale just outside of this room after the talk is over. So please join me in welcoming my very accomplished friend and colleague, Marisol Moreno.
Thank you, Michael, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, everyone, for being here today. I know it's really nice outside, so I really appreciate that you are choosing to be in this auditorium listening to me for the next hour or so. So the project, my talk today basically is based on my recent book, Crossing Waters, that was published in July. And what I'm doing today is trying to give you a little bit of a general idea of what this project is about. So I would like to begin by asking you, as an audience, right, what images come to mind when you think of the Caribbean? Does anyone want to answer? Blue waters, what else? Music, yes. Vacation, yes. I think we all share that, right? These are just some of the ideas that we associate with the Caribbean. And just to show you, right, some advertisements, these are a little dated, right? But it's just the idea that it's a place full of beauty, natural beauty, adventure, history, etc., right? So these are basically ideas that the global north has associated with the Caribbean as an archipelago, but it happens with other archipelagos too. It's not just the Caribbean. So this image that, you know, again, the association with beaches, vacationing, the bountiful nature, leisure, even luxury, right? But behind these ideas, and yes, it's true that the natural beauty is there, right? But behind these ideas, what we can see is that the view is that the Caribbean and archipelagos in general tend to be, or these islands that constitute archipelagos tend to be ahistorical, they tend to be isolated, therefore conquerable in a way, right? So these ideas actually contrast with the reality that the Caribbean is an archipelago, so the islands are not isolated, right, and distant from one another. In fact, 7,000 years ago, the indigenous peoples who lived in the region crisscrossed those waters. They were in constant movement between one island and another, right? So there was a lot of activity, a lot of movement of people between and among those islands. Also, escaped enslaved Africans who had been brought to the Caribbean also navigated those waters, right? Searching for freedom and places to establish themselves. But the reality is that also the Caribbean is a region that is plagued by the effects of empire. We can think of the Europe, right? Spain, England, France, etc. The US, more recently. So the effects of empire, colonialism, slavery, right? All of these are part of, what some of the reasons that are affecting the Caribbean, the different islands and nations within it, the way that we are seeing it today. So as we speak, as we're sitting here talking about this, seems so far away, right? And technically it is. But hundreds of people, as we speak, are risking their lives right now, trying to cross. They're risking their lives at sea, trying to cross and to make it, especially right now to Puerto Rico. Fleeing Haiti, fleeing the Dominican Republic, Cuba too. In that case, they're mostly trying to make it to the Florida Keys. So although this is, undocumented migration has been happening for decades, what we see is that there's been a significant activity in the recent past, okay? And even 3 days ago, this is 3 days ago, I was preparing this talk. And the headlines in the major Puerto Rican newspaper had to do with this group of 104 undocumented migrants who were stranded in the island of Mona. And I'll tell you a little bit about that soon. They were told that was part of Puerto Rico, which it is, right? And they were left there by the smugglers. So it's about, 102 Haitians and 2 Dominicans in the group. At this point, among them, there were a couple of women who are pregnant, and there were several children, ranging in ages 5, I think, to 15. So this is what's happening right now. And just yesterday, I also, read the news that about 70 people had been intercepted near that same spot, and actually sent back, right? So there's a lot of traffic going on in the region, but this is, it is a humanitarian crisis, and it has been happening for a while. It's just that it's reaching new levels in recent days, and it's probably going to continue to increase for a while. So I just wanted to give you a visual of Isla de Mona, or Mona Island in English. As you can see, this is 21 square miles. It's a relatively small island, 7 by 4 miles. It's actually 45 miles from Puerto Rico and about 38 or so from the Dominican Republic. So it's almost equidistant, between Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic. So it's like it's a plateau, as you see, it just kind of comes straight out of the sea. There's sea cliffs all around it, basically. Very rugged terrain, arid climate, very difficult conditions, and lack of fresh water too. So when people are sent or taken there, they usually, their life is in peril, right? If they are not rescued, they will die because it's really difficult to survive these conditions. So I want to show you where Mona Island is. So of course, this is a map of the Caribbean, mostly the Greater Antilles. And here's Puerto Rico, here's Mona Island, right? So again, it lies right between Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic, but it is part of Puerto Rico, because Puerto Rico is an archipelago. We think of Puerto Rico as one island, and yes, Puerto Rico is the name of the main island, but it is an archipelago. And we have, besides the main island, known as Puerto Rico, we have Culebra, we have Vieques, people live there. We have Mona Island right here. You can barely see it, but that's Monito Island. And Desecheo, right? Caja de Muertos. So there's several islands that constitute the archipelago of Puerto Rico. So why am I wanted to give you this little bit of background of what's happening today so that you can understand a little bit of the relevance, of my book, of my study, right? And I just want to step back a little bit and tell you about the book. And I'm going to start with some of the goals that I had for the book when I was writing it. So first, the idea of bringing attention to the humanitarian crisis unfolding in the Caribbean. So I have a breakdown of the Coast Guard, U.S. Coast Guard interdictions in the region. Dominicans, about 30,000 between the years 1993 and 2020, okay? So Dominicans, about 30,000, Haitians, about 85,000, Cubans, over 110,000, okay? So overall, we are talking about 225,000 plus people interdicted, right? So those are the ones that are caught. Some of them make it to their destination. Others die in the crossing, in the process of crossing, okay? So this is what I'm talking about when I'm referring to this humanitarian crisis in the region. I also want to show how literature and art humanize undocumented migrants, because in the discourse, having been born and raised in Puerto Rico, I heard enough, a lot about how Dominicans and Haitians, were treated and referred to, right? All of the xenophobia, the racism, the anti-Blackness, all of that, right, was really present. So in my research, looking at literature and art, I realized that this was one of the ways to humanize people who have been criminalized and dehumanized because of the extreme conditions that lead them to flee, and search and risk their lives in the process, okay? So another goal of my book is to center the Caribbean in discussions of the border, and I'll return a little bit to this, but when we're talking about border studies, the paradigm in border studies has always been, and for good reason, the Mexico-US border, right? It makes sense. It's, right there, the US and Mexico share that border. I mean, there's a very problematic history there, but it's, it connects directly to the United States. When we think of Latinos in this country, the majority by far are people of Mexican descent, right? So it makes sense that we are paying attention to that border. What I want to say is that there's also this other region that is working as a border, and we also need to pay attention to what's happening there. So And then last, and I have other goals, but I'll stop here. You know, the last one on this list is also to center Blackness in discussions of intra-Caribbean undocumented migration. Because when we are talking about, and what I mean intra-Caribbean is within the Caribbean, right? I'm not talking about migration to the continental United States, within the islands of the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, right? And centering Blackness in these discussions is important, because when we're talking about who are the people who end up making the attempt, you know, to travel by sea, is mostly Black people or Afro-descendants, you know, whether it's Haitians, Dominicans, Cubans recently too. So these are some of my main goals, and just wanted to show you a breakdown of the chapters and tell you a little bit about them before I keep talking, because I have a lot to say. So chapter 1, I try to put border and archipelago and island studies. These are different fields in conversation with one another. And what I also do in that chapter is provide an overview of undocumented migration in the Caribbean. You know, again, I'm focusing on the Spanish-speaking Caribbean for the most part. The exception to that would be Haitian migration to the Dominican Republic, which is something that I also address in the book, okay? In chapter 2, Puerto Rico, border and bridge to the continental US, pretty self-explanatory. I'm looking at Puerto Rico, focusing on Puerto Rico, and seeing how the role of Puerto Rico is like the role of the sea, which can also be a border or a bridge. It is a border if people are not able to get past it, right? You are interdicted, or you die, or if you're in Puerto Rico, maybe you are caught, no, and perhaps deported. So Puerto Rico working as a border, or it can be a bridge, because you either, when people make it to Puerto Rico, many times they're not thinking of staying in Puerto Rico, they use it as a stepping stone to the continental United States. So I focus on that, and I look at that through 3 different examples of literary works, okay, by Puerto Rican authors. Chapter 3, I focus on Dominican migrations, or I call it Dominican crossings. The first part of that chapter is about Dominicans crossing to Puerto Rico via the Mona Passage, so that stretch of water that I talked to you about. And the other part of that chapter is about Haitians crossing into the Dominican Republic. So that's how that chapter is divided. And I'm looking at literature and I'm looking at art and seeing how these movements are represented in both, okay? And finally, almost finally, chapter 4, Cubans at Sea, the Balsero Crisis in Literature and Art. The focus here is actually on the Balsero or rafter crisis of 1994, okay? Because that was the moment that marked a shift in US policy toward Cubans trying to make it to the US. In the end, this is what led to the wet foot, dry foot policy that was in place up until relatively recently, until 2017. Okay, so I look at the Balsero crisis again in literature and art. And in the epilogue, I return to Puerto Rico, but now Puerto Rico post-Hurricane Maria, post-earthquakes, still in the middle of a crisis, financial crisis, and well, more recently, Fiona, et cetera, but that doesn't, the book was out already, right? But what role is Puerto Rico playing after all of these disasters? And but based on the recent news, it continues to attract people, right? People are still trying to make it there. which goes a little bit against my argument because at some point there was quite a decrease in undocumented migration to Puerto Rico, but we're seeing it go up again. So that's not captured in the book because it's too recent. So in the end, Crossing Waters, my book, is informed by the urgent circumstances that lead to undocumented migration in the Caribbean. And these include the following: anti-Blackness, right? So the first picture here is a protest by Dominicans of Haitian descent after the passing of what is called La Sentencia, the law that denationalized and rendered stateless hundreds of thousands of Dominicans of Haitian descent, okay? And then more recent protests in Puerto Rico against racism, okay? So anti-Blackness would be one of the crises. Also, and I apologize for, those are the reflections of the light, so it's kind of cutting some of the words here. But so climate change and natural disasters. We can think of the earthquake in Haiti in 2010. That led to mass migration from Haiti at that moment, people desperate, trying to survive. Both of these photos are allow us to see some of the damage done by Hurricane Matthew in 2016. The first one is in Santo Domingo, the second one is in Haiti, okay? But both sides of the island were affected. So these types of events that we know will become more severe and more frequent are definitely playing a role in the uptick in undocumented migration in the region. And last but not least, the political and economic crises that are happening in each and every country, right? Things are happening at different times. Here is a picture of a group of balseros from 1994. So again, my book focuses on this migration specifically. However, we have also been seeing an increase in balsero activity in the recent past due to the circumstances in Cuba right now, okay? So that is something that time will tell, you know, how the numbers compare. In fact, actually, I have seen some headlines that say that the proportions of people leaving the island in recent months or even within the last year by now have surpassed the amounts we saw back during the Balsero crisis. So I'm just waiting for the sociologists and all of them to dissect all that information so that I can somehow, you know, continue working on it, okay? Getting good numbers and statistics from them. So the works I examine challenge the view of the Caribbean as a paradise, as you know, that's one of the main points that I try to make in the book, to show instead that it is a border, that it also functions as a borderland sometimes. It is also a region where death is a constant, okay? And also it's where the archipelago of Puerto Rico becomes a stepping stone to the continental United States. So that role of Puerto Rico in all of that. And in doing so, Puerto Rico then disrupts the plans of the US, you know, because the region is quite militarized. And the US needs and wants to have control over that region. But the fact that Puerto Rico continues to be a magnet, right, for undocumented migration disrupts those plans, right, or that control. Just to show you some of the ways that the island has been militarized, right? 2 summers ago, I was back home with my family. They're here with me too today, but we were going to a few places we really wanted to see in Puerto Rico along the coast, right? We went to some caves and we were exploring. And we came to this beach, and for the first time in my life, I came face to face with a Border Patrol agent in Puerto Rico. I had seen them at the US-Mexico border, but this was the first time I saw that in Puerto Rico. And to me, it was, I mean, of course I was working on my book. It was a pretty shocking moment. I had never seen that. I'm like, wow, this is actually really, really happening. They're really monitoring the area. So a few hours later, we were at another beach, and the same guy showed up. So it was clear that he was doing the rounds, right? And I ended up talking to him for a little while and asking him some questions, and he mentioned the drugs and the usual rhetoric, criminals coming, et cetera. But just to give you an idea of where these beaches are, one was Isabela up here, and the other one was Aguadilla. So they do patrol, the whole western coast and northwestern coast of Puerto Rico, searching for people, who are trying to come in. They usually come at night, but it has happened during the day too. All right, so in the book, I am focusing on the process of crossing waters, therefore the title. So I'm really interested in that moment of in-betweenness between the departure point and the arrival point. There's so much written about the before and the after, but not much about the in-between, right? There's so many unknowns about it. So I want to bring attention, by doing this to the fact that history is also made at sea. We tend to think of history as something that happens on land only, but it also happens at sea. And I also want to, with this, unsettle the centrality of the Mexico-US border in Latino and border studies, as I told you already, right? In order to examine the parallels that exist between both regions. Because it doesn't serve anyone when we don't look at what's happening, in different regions and try to engage in interdisciplinary studies, and dialogues about what's happening. So, here's the typical landscape, right, that we associate with the Sonora Desert. We know many people die trying to cross, right? The desert and the Caribbean, we tend not to view them as landscapes or seascapes that would have anything in common. But the truth is, by reading the works of literature that I've read, by doing research, by looking at the artwork, there are some commonalities. And some of them, in terms of the risks that people face by crossing both of these regions, some of the ones that they share would be, number one, the inhospitable landscape or seascape, heat stroke, hypothermia, dehydration, thirst, hunger, injury, hallucinations, inclement weather, nature. And when I'm talking about nature, anything that could, put your life in danger, from sharks to snakes in the desert, scorpions, whatever, right? Bandits, criminals, traffickers, all of, people, right? And then border patrols and state surveillance, which could end up injuring people trying to cross, okay? In both cases. So these are some of the common risks that people face in both of those spaces. Another point that I get into in the book is the trope of the Middle Passage, because I see that there's a lot of references to the Middle Passage in many of the works, the literary works and the art that I am looking at. And so it came up frequently in my research, and so I decided I need to address, right? So that's one side of it. The other side is that most people who are affected or undocumented migrants in the Caribbean tend to be Afro-descendant. So all of this is connected, right? And we must remember that, even though some people think of slavery and they go right in their minds, they think of the US right away, we need to remember that when it comes to the transatlantic slave trade, only about 5% of the enslaved Africans ended up in what is now the United States. The rest ended up in Latin America, Central, South, and Caribbean, okay? So the great majority did not come to the US. Therefore, this is something that we cannot overlook when we're talking about the issue of undocumented migration in the Caribbean, because we're talking about descendants, right? And here are some statistics, right? I'm gonna go through that quickly, but what I'm seeing in these works that I'm looking at is that these works resist both internal and external denials of Blackness. So when I say internal, I am referring to the fact that they contest the erasure of Blackness from Caribbean identities, which uphold Hispanismo and Latinidad, which are whitening ideologies. I mean, just think of the phrase that I grew up hearing it all the time, mejorar la raza, right? And according to my students from all over Latin America, this is something that they also hear in their lives. Externally, these works claim Blackness as central to the Hispanophone Caribbean. Again, that's the Spanish-speaking Caribbean. And therefore contest an Anglo-centered Blackness or hegemonic Blackness. So this is some of the dynamics that I'm seeing between these representations of the Middle Passage and Blackness. So one example is of the literary examples is Mayra Santos Febre's, one of her poems in her collection, Boat People. She says, one of her poems says, ahogados todos del Caribe, emisarios de las naciones del pasaje intermedio, Siboneyes todavía suicidándose en rituales de mar, disidentes de Trujillo, de Batista, Duvalier. So my translation, so please forgive any issues, drowned of the Caribbean, emissaries of the nations of the Middle Passage, Siboneyes still committing suicide in sea rituals, dissidents of Trujillo, Batista, Duvalier. So I just want to highlight the reference to the Middle Passage, which is something that comes up in several of the poems in the collection. Some of the works I examined memorialize the seafloor as the final resting place for the lives lost, not only during the Middle Passage, but then also during contemporary undocumented migration in the Caribbean. So that's where some of the parallels come in too. I'm gonna skip that, and I'm gonna go to the work of Sandra Ramos, who's Cuban, and I analyzed several of her works, and this is a fun one. Again, 1994, this is right in the middle of the rafter crisis in Cuba. She depicts the entire island. It calls it La Balsa, right? So the entire island of Cuba as a raft, right? Nighttime, sharks circling, right? So the dangers, everything's happening, pointing to the fact that Cuba is a la deriva, you know, it's like it's kind of lost at sea, and who knows, like all Cubans kind of trying to survive the crisis of the periodo especial, the special period. But this is where I wanted to go, to Yo en el fondo del mar, Me at the bottom of the sea, because I was talking about the bottom of the sea as the final resting place, and how some of these works of literature and visual arts help memorialize those lives lost at sea. Because, you know, sometimes when people are crossing the desert, sometimes families are able to retrieve their remains, or they are found, right? But there's almost no chance of that happening when people die at sea, unless they wash over, if they're close enough to the shore somewhere, right? So the bottom of the sea, the seafloor, acquires an urgent significance in this. And here we see like an alter ego of the artist, right? Laying at the bottom of the sea, surrounded by sharks, right? Other inner tubes, we can assume those people may have drowned. They seem to be kind of far away. Obviously, it's dark. She seems to be exhaling her last few breaths, right? So she's in the process of dying. And there, of course, you have the two little skeletons that are rowing on top of her as if she were the raft, right? One of them looking at us, so the presence of death, right, is everywhere. Same thing with this suitcase that she calls muerte, or dead. She produced a series of suitcases, again in 1994. This is all art inspired by the rafter crisis. And as a matter of fact, her partner was a balsero. He became a rafter. He survived. They were able to be together again, but she has talked about how difficult it was for her when he was at sea and she could not have any contact. She didn't know if it was gonna survive because chances are very low of surviving that voyage. So here, she did a whole series of suitcases. And the suitcases is playing with the idea of traveling, right? You tend to bring your possessions, like what you value with you when you're traveling. It's also seen as an intimate object in a way, or what's contained in a suitcase. And she has spoken about how the series of suitcases helped her like make public what was intimate for Cubans at that point. So there's all sorts of different suitcases, and the one I examine in my book is this one specifically because I am interested again in how it depicts the idea of drowning as a result of trying to cross in a raft. And again, we see, I mean, it's really striking because the natural beauty is really notable, right? All the fish and the coral, etc. But then you're faced with the reality of that skeleton, right? And people kind of pleading for their lives at the bottom. Again, you see the empty rafts, you see the sharks. So death is everywhere. I mean, it's almost like a warning, you're not gonna make it. So these are some of the works that I analyze and that connect to that idea of the seafloor. I also wanted to show you a little bit of the work of Tony Capellan, who's Dominican, or was Dominican. He died unexpectedly in 2017. And he has this piece called Mar Caribe. And I hope you can see, but it's made of flip-flops, okay? And I think when you think of flip-flops, I don't know, when I think of flip-flops, I think of sometimes beaches, right? It's really like also very cheap footwear, right? So there's a few different meanings that we can ascribe to the flip-flops, but these are not flip-flops that the artist went and bought at a store. These were flip-flops that he collected along the beaches of Santo Domingo. So they're basically trash, okay? And all of his installations were the product, he made them with what we would consider trash, okay? That he would collect. So he was doing the work of cleaning the beaches in a way, but also making art with them. So in this case, Mar Caribe, think of the colors, the different hues of blues and greens, and how, at first, if one looks quickly, you're like, oh, that's pretty, right? It seems kind of pretty, it's evocative of the waves, the movement of the waves in the Caribbean. But then, if you look closely, the straps are made of barbed wire. So this barbed wire, of course, can take on a lot of different symbolisms, right? It is something that we associate with borders, with divisions, with militarization of certain zones, right? So if you think of people wearing these flip-flops, this is something that would cause pain, just like their movement would cause pain, suffering, they would draw blood. So each flip-flop will represent, right, these individual stories. Together, they tell us that this migration is a mass migration. It's not an individual story that we're dealing with here. These are entire groups of people trying to find a better life. And then looked at together, it really becomes clear that the Caribbean Sea becomes a border, okay? So these are some of the main ideas that are conveyed, through this piece that I am looking at. And I know I have like 5 minutes, so I'm trying to see where to go next. Well, here's a work by a Cuban artist, Abel Barroso, that he calls Border Patrol. He does a lot of wooden like sculptures, usually games. He has a whole series of like pinball games, and they're really amazing. They're genius. So he did this little box, woodcut, and calls it Border Patrol. But if you see, I don't know if you can see too well, but what's working as the Border Patrol is the sharks. And that becomes a constant theme in many of the works I analyze, how sharks, in the context of the Caribbean, become the Border Patrol. It's nature taking care of the situation, okay? Because so many people die as a result of being eaten by sharks, when they're trying to cross. So, okay. I'll just go back quickly to this one, which is by Sheresade Garcia, who's a Dominican artist. And this is one of her installations, but she paints too. She does everything. And she's one of my favorite artists. And this is, again, it's an installation where the centerpiece, she calls it Cathedral. And as you can see, it's made of inner tubes, that you can just purchase at a store, like inflatable inner tubes, painted in gold, and she's playing there with the idea of salvation, right? I mean, there is a commentary on the Catholic Church and the connection to the history of the Dominican Republic and such, but it's also the idea of these inner tubes can provide salvation, right? Salvation for the people who are desperately trying to make it to the other side to survive, right? So she's working with that. In the back, she also has the inflatable inner tubes, in this case, different hues of blue. She ties them together with plastic ties, similar to the ones used by Border Patrol to tie the hands of the people they apprehend trying to cross the border. So that's very meaningful, right there. In any case, there's a few other works that I would have liked to tell you about, but I don't have time. We're out of time. But I'm happy to answer any questions. If you have any comments, I appreciate it. Yes.
Thanks for a really interesting presentation. I wanted to ask about the study of migration in the part of the world that you're focusing on. And there are many different disciplines that take this as a subject of study. What do you think, like what do literature and art, like using kind of that as the window onto the subject, what does that bring to the subject that other means of inquiry don't?
That's a very good question. Before I answer that, I will say that in conducting research for this book, it was very difficult to find anything from other fields, anthropology, sociology, anything related to undocumented migration in the Hispanophone Caribbean, okay? So there's a lot about the conditions in the home countries, there's a lot about Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, et cetera, in the US, but there's hardly anything, just like a couple of books, to be honest, on the actual undocumented migration and the way it works in the context of the Caribbean Sea, right? So there's not that much, which was one of the problems, okay? So a lot of more work needs to be done on this, and from different disciplines, you know, not from the humanities. However, there is attention, you know, usually newspapers, et cetera, and the rhetoric tends to be the same, which is the illegality of it, people being criminalized, dehumanized as a result of these decisions, right? And no one leaves, I believe no one leaves their homes. It's not something one takes lightly. It's not a decision one takes lightly. You have to be really desperate to risk your life the way that so many people are doing. So what I saw was an opportunity to call attention, because even when you're talking about the field of Latino and Latina literature, let's say, right? There's still not enough written about undocumented migration in the field of Latino literature, which is interesting. There's a lot about the border and all that, but within literature and literary works taking on that subject, it's increasing lately, but there's a lot more that needs to be happening there. So in that sense, given the general invisibility that a lot of these issues have, I saw this, it struck me that I started to see a correlation between different works of art by people in Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Cuba, or their diasporas, you know, and I started to put it together, trying to fill what I felt was a gap in the scholarship, right? And hopefully it'll lead to more studies, because a lot more needs to be done. This is a crisis that's happening still right now, and it's getting worse as we speak. So yeah, I hope it, you know, inspires some people to do some of this work from other disciplines. But thank you. Yeah, that's great. Any other questions or thoughts? Yes.
Marisa, you looked at poetry as well?
I do.
Can you give us one example? Do you have an example, or read us an example of?
Well, the one I read by Mayra Santos Febres, this is just a little excerpt from a very long poem called Aquí abajo bailan concejales. So here at the bottom, I don't know how to say concejales in English right now. Just the elder men, you know, the drowned from way back, you know, they're dancing like a ritual, right? So this is a little bit of that. And then I do an analysis of this poem by Elizabeth Acevedo, who's Dominican, and it's called La Santa Maria. And this excerpt leaves something for our black dead to play in, the bones of their brown bodies walking the Atlantic floor to dance around the first vessel. So it's all about La Santa Maria and Columbus. And I don't know if you remember, but at some point a few years ago, they thought they had found the wreckage of La Santa Maria. It ended up after some studies that it was not, but this poem was inspired at that moment when they thought they had found it, and the poetic voice is saying, leave the wreckage there, don't disturb it. Our dead are playing in it. our ancestors, the enslaved, because Columbus and the association with slavery, right? So this is a very powerful poem that I look at. But I look at, I have short stories that I analyze. I analyze an entire play by a Cuban American, Nilo Cruz, who won the Pulitzer for his play Anna in the Tropics. So I analyzed another one called Bicycle Country. It was all about the periodo especial, the special period in Cuba where there was no gas, so people had to use bikes. And then the characters become balseros. So it's all about them and what happens at sea as they're trying to make it to the Florida Keys. I even analyze a work of children's literature or YA literature on there's almost nothing written on Mona Island that I told you about between the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico, and there's this one kid's book, so I analyze that too. So yeah, I deal with a range of different types of literary works, different genres, plus then some of the visual art too. Thank you for that question. Well, if you think of anything, I'm happy to answer questions after we are done. But for now, thank you so much for being here and taking time to listen. Thank you.